Today we take a look into a world that I find fascinating and have limited experience with. Mathematics, specifically the math behind some data center functions. We even brought in a real live doctor of mathematics to talk about it. Let's take a listen. Hello, and welcome to the ExploreVM podcast. Today we dive into the world of mathematics behind data protection and replication. But first, we're going to mix it up a little bit. I've got a co-host with me today. Rob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, I am Rob Fogarty. I am a data warehouse developer for the last 3 or 4 years or so. Before that, I was a .NET developer for 5 or 6 years. And I believe I'm here because I am marginally better at math than Paul is.
Yeah, I've known Rob for many years now. He shares an interest in not only technology and mathematics and strategic investments. He's one of my closest friends. We were in each other's weddings, so I thought it'd be a good opportunity for him to jump in here and help me with some of the math topics that I'm not the greatest with. And on that note, on to our guest. Rachel, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Traylor. I'm the founder of the Math Citadel, so it's an independent research firm in mathematics. I would be the resident mathematician on this show, I guess.
All right, so why don't we just jump right into it? Why don't you tell us about your most recent article?
So the most recent article, the Math Citadel publishes a lot of stuff in mathematics, some of it pure, some of it applied, some of it original research. This particular article, I wanted to start writing about the mathematics of data loss and data protection. So obviously you can get into erasure coding and things like that, and those will come later. But this article dealt with data loss, and data loss comes in several different ways, but we'll just take kind of the simplest form, which is just drive failures, right? Let's just take traditional RAID. So drives fail, right? One after another. And we can look at those as essentially they're random events. You don't know when they're going to fail. So if you have a whole bunch of drives in your system or in a RAID group or enclosure, then those failures will come randomly. So they're random variables. And the number of failures that happen in some window of time is also random. These things are called stochastic processes. So the sequence of random failures or the number of random failures that happens in an interval is a random process. So what the article talks about is a particular kind of random process, a counting process. And so the article's on the Math Citadel. I won't do the math lecture this way, as particular as of what it is. What's important to note about it is some of the assumptions aren't exactly met when you use them to model data loss. So in particular, what I looked at was Nutanix published a paper looking at node failures in clusters for their infrastructure. And you guys can totally correct me if I get any of the terminology wrong, because just as you aren't math people, I'm not a tech person. So you can totally correct me on that. So basically what they call a replication factor of 2, that means one node can fail, and when the second node goes down or something happens, you're going to lose some data. And if that node goes down before the first one that went down is rebuilt, then you're going to have problems.
Yeah.
So RF3 means 2 of them can go down, and if a third one goes down during the time basically those 2 are down and being rebuilt, you're going to be in trouble. So what I go through is essentially the way they modeled it was using this Poisson process. So node failures happen randomly. You don't know when they're going to happen. And when one happens, then there's a random interval of time between the time the first one fails and the time the next one fails. So what you want to find out is, well, what's the probability that random time between failures is smaller than the time it takes to rebuild that node, right? Because that's the probability of data loss.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So that's essentially what I wrote in my article, was going through, and like I said, the article kind of goes through the calculations. I won't do that on the podcast. The interesting thing about it is Poisson processes mathematically are used for tons of stuff. They can be used to model arrivals into a grocery store or drive failures or anything where just things arrive randomly. But and it's a great model. It really is. I think Nutanix did a great job using that, although I don't know if they totally understood that's what they were doing reading the paper. I'm not totally sure. Now, one thing and I'm working with Howard Marks on this, one thing to note about that Nutanix paper is they just talk about node failures and another node failure. That's only one way to lose data, right? If a node goes down or you take it offline and then a drive fails on another node, you're kind of also in trouble.
Yeah.
So however, that is a Poisson process too, right? They're different categories of events, right? Node failures and drive failures are different, but they're still, right? They're still random events and they arrive at random times. So you can actually account for that mathematically by generalizing the Poisson process to a mixture Poisson process. It's called a switching process. So my point in the article was I liked that they used, as opposed to, the deep learning kind of crap. I'm sure it'll eventually become known that I'm not a fan. It's an elegant model. You can diagram it out. It's explainable. It's interpretable. But, what happens when the data doesn't totally line up? So for one thing that I pointed out in particular, assumptions matter. So their Poisson process, great choice. It's a great way to do it. It makes total sense. But mathematically, you have to be kind of careful with the assumptions that you make. So mathematically, there are some assumptions, in particular, that those random times between failures are independent of each other. So those random times between failures are themselves random variables, and those random variables are independent of each other. That's not true. NetApp has done a lot of work that shows that's not true. Not only is it not true, it's like really not true. They're heavily not independent. Now, I'm careful not to use the word correlated. Correlated is a linear measure of association. It's not, so uncorrelated and independent are not the same thing. So that's not true. Latent sector errors are not independent, right? Drive failures are not successive drive failures. Those random events are not independent of each other. Mm-hmm. All of those things are not independent. So what I discussed in the article was, well, the Poisson model assumes that. It assumes that it is. Well, crap, now what? So does that mean the model's bad? No. That's my argument. It simply means the model isn't general enough. So I'm trying to figure out how to get not too math heavy here.
Well, you can throw out some mathematics. It's a technical podcast.
So in statistics and probability, when we say independent, we mean if two events are independent, it means that the probability of one event occurring does not affect the other one occurring. So if you flip two coins, right? If I flip a quarter and a dime, the outcome of the quarter has nothing to do with what's going to happen with that dime.
Right.
Okay. That's the definition of independent. Those two events are independent, and then there's a probabilistic definition to match it. Now, we've heard correlation, association, mutual information. All of those things are an attempt to measure what happens. What is the definition of dependent? So throwing that out there, what's the definition of dependent? Not correlated. That's not the same thing. Not, it's simply not independent. Okay. That's all it is. It's defined mathematically as a negation of independence. Well, the problem with that is when we started to develop stuff in statistics, independent random variables give you a whole lot of really nice mathematical properties. So I can derive all sorts of really cool stuff, all of your distributions, all of these processes, all of your statistical tests, almost all of them are based on the assumption that everything underlying it is independent, because the mathematics gets really ugly if you don't have it. Because, well, if you don't have dependent means I don't have independence. What does that mean? All I can tell you now is that means I don't have the properties that I would have liked. It doesn't tell you what kinds of things you do have. So the Poisson process was developed assuming these independent increments because we didn't have any other way to deal with it. It's not totally true anymore. So what needed to happen was to develop the probabilistic notion of dependence among random variables. If you can do that, and I have, now you can start saying, well, we don't just have to define a Poisson process to have independent increments. We can figure out what would a more general version look like now that we know what kinds of properties dependence gives us and under what conditions. So that was kind of the math part of the overview of the article, was to point out what a Poisson process was and try to reconcile the fact that though Nutanix did a great job using that Poisson process to model their data, the assumptions weren't met, and there's a lot of other data to suggest that those assumptions are really not met. But how do you reconcile that? It's not in giving up and trying to figure out how to twist the data. It's in generalizing the mathematics to reconcile that, to give you a better model.
So can you tell us a little bit about the research that you mentioned from NetApp? I've not heard this part yet, so I'm kind of intrigued on that one. Where
sure.
the failures are kind of related?
So they did a couple of things. They sponsored a couple of papers. They talked about latent sector errors and data corruption. And what they found was, they also did a really big study, I think in 2007 at the FAST conference on drive failures. And what they found was they actually started measuring the time between successive drive failures. So I'll start with each one. They did this for hard drives, latent sector errors, and instances of data corruption.
Okay.
So what they found with each of those things when they measured it is what they should have gotten was that the probability that a drive failure occurs should have no bearing on the fact that a drive failure occurred before it. So if you failed today, it shouldn't matter whether you were the first failure in the system or the third or the fifth or whatever, however many came before you. Right? That's what it would mean to be independent. They did a very, very large, I believe they studied several 100,000 drive instances over a few years, and the data does not show that at all.
Okay.
So it's a pity they weren't more, I think they were at the FAST conference and then Sigmetrics, but kind of conferences tend to end up siloed. People sort of forget after they're gone about how much of a, I guess you could say how much of a breakthrough that was, because nobody really bothered to care, I think.
Yeah.
Before that. And that information is important, even if it's kind of bad news when it first came out. Knowing that something is not independent, what that means is if two events are now no longer independent or dependent on each other, it means that knowledge of one increases the probability of the other one occurring. You can never lose information, right? So if you know something, that's going to increase the probability of another thing happening. That's how conditional probability works. So what that means is if you assume that successive drive failures are independent, like Nutanix did, it means you're underestimating your risk of data loss. Actually, potentially by a lot, depending on just how not independent they are.
Okay.
So
I'm wrapping my head around all of this as we go. It's a good learning experience for me for sure, and I'm hoping, for everyone else out there listening. So, okay, they're potentially, and this is not a knock on Nutanix, just looking at the math. So how do we improve this? How do we improve this where we're not having such a big gap in this? What might actually happen?
So to me, the way to improve this is to go all the way back to the beginning, go past the data, go past the application, go back to the abstract mathematics and say, well, the first question was, is the model bad? Does it make sense to model it in a way where random events come in the stream? No, that makes total sense. Okay, well, what were the assumptions on that? So you go down the line and go, well, crap, we made these assumptions and they're not true anymore. So what do? The way to fix it is to go all the way back and say, well, why did we have to make those assumptions? Well, it's because we don't know how to deal with the notion of dependence among random variables, because all the math gets really icky, especially dealing with measure on dependent stuff, and it gets pretty heavy. So that's where so you go for the root cause. Well, what would be the root solution, develop a formal notion of what it means for variables in a sequence to depend on each other and how. What this can also mean too is the notion of correlation, which is a fairly weak linear measure. That's all it really gives you. It means that I can break that down now in terms of what I've termed the dependency coefficient. So I'm actually working on a video on this now, but so let's go back to coin flips.
Okay.
If you flip a coin and then another coin, right? Obviously the second coin doesn't depend on the first one. The outcome doesn't matter. So the probability of getting a heads for the second coin is still a half, right? What if it weren't? What if when I flip that first coin, if it came up heads, the probability of getting a heads on the second flip increased? So the outcome of the first one, it affected the second one. And if it came up tails, then the probability of getting a heads would decrease, the probability of getting a tails would increase. Okay, so that, you can basically look at that dependence using what I've called a dependency coefficient. Somewhere it's something between 0 and 1, and it's a factor that you weight the original probability by. So the original probability for that second coin was just, say, a half. But if I want to weight it to, say, 3/4, now I basically have a factor, a dependency coefficient, that's changing that weight. So a dependency coefficient of 1 would mean that everything is completely deterministic depending on the dependency structure after the first outcome. So we'll stick with, like, if everything depends on the outcome of the first one. So the third one, basically, if you flip the third coin, it doesn't care what happened to the second coin, but it does care what happened to that first coin. Fourth one, same thing. Doesn't care what happened to second and third, does care about the first one. That's called first kind dependence. And if the dependency coefficient is 1, as soon as I flip that first coin, it comes up heads, all the rest of them will be heads. There's nothing random anymore. That's the extreme. It's totally deterministic. The other end, if the dependency coefficient is 0, then it means they're totally independent. We're back to the same kind of standard coin flips we all know and love. But that means now you get everything in between. You get levels of dependence now. And those things can be developed into different mathematical structures that provide different mathematical probabilities and probability distributions that now can handle what happens when those things are dependent, whereas before they could not. How does this generalize up to what we're doing? Well, you need probability underneath the Poisson process is something called a Poisson distribution. It's a probability distribution that governs the number of random events that occur in a sequence of time. If you can move that notion of dependence to create a generalized Poisson distribution, now you have a generalized Poisson process, and you can reconcile the fact that that is a good model to model drive failures or latent sector errors or whatever it is you want to model, but also take into account the fact that we have data that suggests they're dependent and start to measure how they're dependent. Right? Is it when a drive failure happens, does it care about all the ones that came before it? Just the last one? Just the first one? Just maybe 2 in the middle? How? Right? Now you can start talking about not just that they're dependent, but how are they dependent? Hopefully I haven't lost anybody.
I'm trying to keep up. Rob, how are you doing over there?
I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. When I read your article, that's sort of what I came away thinking. Not in those like black and white of terms, actually, but I guess I'm more process-driven and data-driven, so I thought of it as they should really be monitoring this data in a different way. Like, we know when a node fails, we know which node it was, so we can use that data to group them together and say, if these two nodes failed within, 10 milliseconds of each other, then that is one failure, and they are then linked together. And we can do that for as many nodes as we have and as many combinations as we need to, because we are using computers, and we can kind of back into the actual probability that any certain number of nodes will fail at any given time.
We can look at too, especially with these nodes, once we discover that there is a link, and that's what standard correlation shows you, right? Oh, these two things are correlated. Yay. We know they're associated, but we still don't understand quite how.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's if we can show that there's a link, which is all we can do right now, if you go back and recreate this notion of probabilistic dependence that has different structures Now we can say not only are they dependent, but we can show you just how they're dependent on each other. How much do they affect one another? And not just in a linear sense, but you can account for the stuff underneath it that could be nonlinear, right? Linear models we like everything to be a line or all these relationships, but they rarely are. Now you can start uncovering things you couldn't have before that were a little bit more subtle. That's kind of the research that I do, and kind of the goals of where I'm trying to go with what 9 months ago seemed like a what are you doing? Why are you doing this? I didn't actually know that it was going to come out this way either. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It was the typical scientist thing. There's like an XKCD comic about that where like a scientist touches something and gets shocked and is like, I wonder what happens if I do this every time. Right? It's kind of the same thing, or you look at something and you like, kind of what mathematicians do is we look at something that is actually working just fine and go, I wonder what happens if you break it. Like, what happens if you didn't have that anymore? What are you left with?
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what I did when I started down this line of research. I had no idea what kind of applications, if any, would come out of it.
So outside of this article, I guess a little bit of history here. I met you at Tech Field Day 15. You were a delegate as well, and apparently have spoke at a field day before the one I was at. So what other math-related research have you done that is tied to computers, to compute, to data center storage, etc.?
So, and actually this is good since you guys are more of the data center experts. My dissertation was on basically the term being stochastic reliability on servers. Server being the math term here right? I realized when I presented this at the Storage Developers Conference, I was like, all right, when I say these assumptions, I don't literally mean an IT server. We can use it with just general object here. So the idea on that was looking to model reliability of servers and those networks of them when you have random traffic coming in, whether it be stream, like sometimes you have traffic coming in as a pure stream, right? You would almost say a continuous stream.
Yeah.
For computer perspectives, everything's ultimately discrete, but that traffic coming in is random, a Poisson process, if you will. Actually, that's exactly what I used. A slightly more general version, but that's what I used. And when a job comes into a server or you're going through a checkout line, you don't know how long it's going to take to process that job. It's a random amount of time, but it follows some probability distribution. Cool. Now, each job that comes, though, the original paper I based my dissertation on assumed that if you both came with a request for a database, that you guys would put the same amount of stress on that database. Mm-hmm. We all know that's not true, right? Queries definitely stress the system very differently depending on how big or small it is.
Right.
So what I did was I said, okay, that's not realistic. Let's assume that the stresses are also random. So we now have 3 massive sets of random variables that we're trying to deal with. And I want to figure out the probability that server is going to fail before a certain time. And I want to find a formula for it. I did find a formula for it. And I dealt with all sorts of so then I got all mathy, right? Because my doctorate's in math, and go, what happens if you do this? What happens if the server deals with load balancing? Never did get a closed form for that one. Load balancing is complicated mathematically. I just want to point that out. Like, from a probabilistic perspective, it is complicated to deal with.
Right.
Because we would say it has full memory, right? You are trying to basically allocate it somewhere that's the least occupied, right? But what's the least occupied? It depends on what came before it, and completely so, right? It has full memory, so that made my life a lot more difficult.
Right.
I started to look too at networks of them. Well, what happens if I can give you the survival function for one, we'll call it a node in that server, although I realize that's probably a loaded term as well. But what happens if you put a network of these together? Can I tell you the probability of failure for the whole system? Yes, actually. And it doesn't matter what topology you have. Doesn't matter if they're arranged in series, parallel, or a mixture thereof, or how many you have, or if the traffic is correlated. It doesn't matter. I can still tell you the formula to find that probability of failure. under really general terms. So that's some of the stuff that I would say has what I'm hoping has some implications in basically the technology industry. When I gave a talk at SDC, I got some great feedback on that one. For instance, they told me that the stress that you would bring to a server after the job's completed, I assumed that, well, the job's done, so now there's no lingering effect of that job left. Turns out, apparently, that's not true. If you leave and maybe you guys can give some examples of that, or that's worth a discussion or something like that. But there's other things that, if I'm going to create a good mathematical model, it should be elegant and pretty from my perspective, but it should also be useful to you guys, right? Does it actually mirror reality? Like the Poisson process, right? It mostly mirrors reality except for this one little thing. Well, if I fix that one little thing, now it does mirror reality much better. And in a way that you can still, you can process that kind of stuff in real time, as opposed to training a deep learning model that has to take forever to spin up and it's constantly feeding forward and feeding back. If you can have something that's an elegant, simple formula, you can process this stuff in real time and react to it in real time. That's why I try to go that direction. Ultimately, as much as I love pure mathematics, the satisfaction comes in people like you guys giving me feedback, seeing that, okay, yes, it mirrors reality, or nah, not quite, and this is kind of what we see instead, and then me going back and fixing it and creating something that you guys can use.
So I'm working on trying to come up with more questions while still trying to process everything. Rob, anything comes to mind with you? Any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?
I don't know.
Sorry.
Again, what you said makes sense. It's always nice to live in the mathematical world where everything is perfect, but then, in the real world we've got air resistance and, that sort of thing.
We do, but then what did we do? We went back and we created better mathematical models to handle the air resistance, right? You start with the simple ones, and then when you realize, all right, well, it would be nice if that would work, but it doesn't. But you can't start with air resistance. You started without it and then say, oh, well, now we just can factor it into and keep the model simple.
Right, exactly.
Sort of.
Right. So it comes down to the models are only as good as the things that we're actually thinking to monitor, really.
Right. The constant feedback, I think, between mathematicians and engineers is something that kind of is getting lost. Because I came from an academic background, and I don't think anyone in the math department gets kind of siloed away in usually the crappiest building on campus with the least amount of funding. But they don't talk to anybody. We don't talk to anybody outside the math department. We don't talk to other engineers. We don't even talk to computer scientists as far as academics go. And that's just within the university, let alone making the effort to try to some of the best engineers were either mathematicians or worked very closely with them, especially for a lot of this, the theoretical developments in engineering, like fluid dynamics, for example. That was collaborations between engineers doing experiments and mathematicians. I feel like we kind of lost that. We don't see that much of an attempt to reach across the aisle on both sides anymore to try to make stuff work anymore.
Right. You absolutely see that in the world of IT as well, where the networking guys stick together and the database guys are huddled in their group, and the data center people are like, all right, no, this is our stuff, don't touch it. And there's a lot to be learned when you go work with that network team and say, all right, Rob's got this database, it's going to need this amount of resources, it's going to peak at these times, how do we build for that? And that's actually, I think, a big stimulus behind the DevOps culture as well, is trying to get back to working together to make everything better.
Sure, you guys all have and we all, even on the research side, I have expertise that lots of people don't, but I don't have any of the engineering background. So if I wanted to find another way to generalize, say, some stochastic reliability models, I can keep myself very busy and going, what happens if you do this? But some of the best ideas can come from, actually, those job stresses don't totally disappear when the job is completed. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they give me an example. And I say, so you're telling me that the residual kind of after effect that's left behind is random? Well, yeah. Now I have another set of random variables. Now I can deal with that. But I would never have known to question that unless someone with expertise like you guys pointed it out to me, unless we actually talked together and I learned some of like what you guys work on or what you guys do, or it can inspire some really interesting research problems.
Right.
Part of it's not just the research I do for the Math Citadel, but part of it is there is a large amount of, you almost call it like mathematical fear, right? It's the thing you torture your kids with. It's the thing that everyone is perfectly comfortable saying, like, I was not good at this and I'm scared of it. But, if you go to, say, one of those paint your own pottery studios, no one's sitting there saying, well, I'm not a professional artist, I can't be in here.
Right.
No, you just go and you have fun with it because it's kind of part of a culture. I think we as mathematicians are really bad at trying to do that. Because there's a lot of people I've met that either they did love math, and I've taught some, they did love math and they're like, I hate it now. That sucks. I try to fix that. I tried to fix that when I was lecturing. And that's so sad. And then there's other ones that are like, well, I wish that I could learn some of we'll call it the ignored topics in mathematics. So like, if you guys are in data protection, underneath all that is a bunch of erasure coding. Well, underneath that is a bunch of abstract algebra. It's pretty cool stuff. And it's really not terribly, you don't need a graduate degree to grasp it. It just needs to be presented in the right way that lets you get a hold of it. That's what I'm also trying to do, is people focus too much on getting kids to like math, but they've left the adults behind. You guys don't care about solving for X anymore, or finding like, at what rate is the balloon rising if the angle is changing by, right? Again, nobody cares about that. What you want to know and what you care about are the topics that are missed. Like, how does fractal image compression work? How does, there's a lot of math behind that. How does erasure coding work? How, what math is in data protection? What math is in network traffic? If you want to assign, you want to deal with the network traffic flow, even take it in from a totally spaced out from a power grid perspective, right? You've got a network and you've got a flow going through that network. How do you deal with surges? How do you deal with spikes in traffic? Look at your freeways, right? You get spikes at rush hour and traffic slows down. There's an entire branch of mathematics called queuing theory that studies this, that studies all this kinds of stuff. And it gets ignored because the kids aren't ready for it. And no one's trying to reach the adults to present these things. We just leave it in our little hole of mathematics and call it good. I want to fix that. I really do. Besides the fact that, for instance, one thing I looked into was anomaly detection. That's kind of the buzzword these days. Doesn't matter what industry you're in now. Is looking for, if you've got a time series and you want to know if the next point, is this weird? Is this indicative of a cyber attack or whatever? How do you identify that? So some of the stuff, for instance, finance has eaten up mathematicians for decades. In fact, most people with my mathematical background in particular in stochastic analysis tend to go work on Wall Street. I interviewed on Wall Street. I don't ever want to interview on Wall Street again. Not for me. But that's where most of them go. But the problem is those developments in mathematics can have massive uses, I think, in networking. Because ultimately, if you're allocating resources across a network, how is that ultimately any different from allocating a stream of money into a portfolio?
Right.
It's not. And we've got a lot of mathematics to deal with that, really nice, elegant mathematics, but it never crosses that bridge because everyone stays siloed. So, I've interviewed enough around. We're like, well, we're kind of looking for a data scientist, not a mathematician. I think that's mistaken. Yeah. Because a mathematician, as much crap as we get for having our head in the clouds, sometimes by abstracting yourself away from the specific application, not until then do you see the actual connections across industries and the mathematics to fix it, right? You're trying to solve a problem over here in networking. Like, actually, this is no different than allocating a financial portfolio, and we already have the math to solve it. It's already there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But, you know, a network engineer is not going to see that, and a finance person isn't necessarily going to see it. It's those of us with our heads in the clouds that typically see it, because we kind of, that's usually the old joke is, you know, oh, there's a constant or whatever, and we don't care. Like, engineers care about constants and units and stuff. It's like, yeah, we don't care. don't care. Because abstractly they don't matter. It's something I think is missing. I think it's why pure research in industry has declined. Because those abstract sort of, the appreciation for the abstract is kind of going away. Plus, math isn't part of the culture the way that art is, or even CS is now.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's tons of stuff out there to get people involved in coding, and there's lots of great stuff to, you know, if you're an adult and you're trying to start somewhere new, there's almost so many resources, you don't know where to look or start anymore, which is great. I mean, there's some nice things about that. We don't have that for math, and it's fundamentally what makes everything work. And nobody's really trying to fix it.
Well, Rachel, with our last couple of minutes here, I figured I'd give you a platform to discuss the Math Citadel and what you're doing over there with that.
Okay. So the Math Citadel, I guess beyond my intro monologue, that's kind of my answer to some of those facets of problems, bringing mathematics as part of the culture, as a presence in the community, as well as bringing a partnership with business and pure research back. Some of the things we do, so I publish posts like the one you guys read, and that's not original research, right? That's me just discussing some mathematics. Right. I do publish all my original research, and I do it a little bit differently. We'll publish the full paper for those that are interested in proofs. I also publish it as a blog post with the proofs removed so that nobody gets scared. And I also am trying to make sure that I have videos that explain the research in like smaller bite-sized pieces, because what good is it if you can't reach it? So I try to bring research, instead of just hiding it away in a journal that no one's going to read, I'm trying to bring it in multiple formats because I'm trying to foster collaboration. We put up book reviews. So I put up reviews of tons of different math textbooks. I think I have 11 of them now. I've either read, taught from, or studied from every single one I put up. I've got a lot of ones to go, so I've studied a lot of math. We do a podcast called Aftermath. That one's a little more philosophical with my co-researcher, Jason Hathcock. And we're also starting to move into the realm of just straight up support. So if people are wanting to support the mission of just making math part of the culture, I'd like to actually open up a physical math citadel someday. Long-term goals. But I'm also trying to start with a different kind of business model in research partnerships. So most of the time, companies or large companies can afford to have research in-house. We'll say research. Usually they mean advanced development. Mm-hmm. But they can afford to have that in-house. Or they fund universities. But having been an academic on both sides of the aisle, both ones who have negotiated contracts with universities and been on the professor side where you're getting piddles for that, the university administration takes about 75% of the total grant money in overhead. The professor will see maybe a quarter of your total grant money. So when you see a professor say, I got a $100,000 grant, no. The university got a $100,000 grant. He got 25 grand and he's got to support 2 grad students off that. Right? So what I'm trying to do is kind of help the little guys form a rebel alliance, if you will. So I offer research partnerships. So you can basically sponsor research that I'm doing, and you get to keep 100% of the IP that results from discussions that you and I have. So if you and I discuss research, like, for instance, like the kind of stuff we discuss now, and you saw an application, a specific application, I'll help you write the patent and you keep it. It's all yours. No negotiations, no anything. It would be a fraction of the cost with no overhead. So I'm trying to create kind of a third alternative for pure research that mitigates the risk of developing a large Bell Labs type thing in-house especially if you're a small company and can't afford it. Because if you're a small company, those patents are kind of your defense and your offense to compete with the big guys. So you're stuck in a catch-22, and I'm trying to move into the middle of that problem and try to solve it. So that's there's my plug. We do also, my co-researcher, Jason Hathcock, is a photographer, so we have an art gallery of some of his work. We do have a shop with gear, but kind of all in all, we're just trying to bring mathematics and make it more of a presence in the way it kind of used to be when Bell Labs was kind of a really big thing, or during World War II. I mean, tons of mathematics developed during that, both in private and public partnerships that we still use today, but had massive applications. It produced massive inventions. I'm trying to rekindle that a little bit. That's kind of the overall mission of the Math Citadel.
Well, that's absolutely a mission I can get behind. Now, Rob, you don't really have a social presence. Rachel, where can people...
In more ways than one.
Rachel, where can people find you online? Should they want to read more of your articles or work with you?
TheMathCitadel.com is the way to connect. Like I said, I publish all my research open access. Everything is open access, so everything is there, including information about partnerships and how to contact. You can also find me on Twitter at Mathpocalypse. At Math Citadel is the Math Citadel Twitter account. So at Mathpocalypse would be my Twitter account. And if anyone wants to contact me, there's a contact form on themathcitadel.com. If you're interested in either supporting, small levels of support via Patreon, or if you're looking more for some fun patents, then you can talk to me about research partnerships.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time. This is, for me at least, and I hope others, it's been a very informative episode.
Thank you very much for having me on, both of you.
And thank you for listening. Watch for an upcoming joint video between myself and Dr. Rachel Traylor as we dive deeper into a few tech topics and explore the mathematics behind them. I will also be bringing back Rob as a co-host from time to time as well. If you'd like to join the conversation about today's topic, have an idea for a future show, or like to be a guest, please reach out to me on Twitter at ExploreVM, Facebook.com/ExploreVM, or email me, paul@ExploreVM.com. Once again, thank you for listening.
Just try to hold on.
Yeah.